Hello, everyone. Before we start, don't forget to like, subscribe, and leave a comment with where you from and what time it is. That way, YouTube will keep pulling you stories like this. Now, let the shadows take over. Story 1, The Neighbor in 6B. Mr. Dennis Rourke. The summer I moved to Dayton, Ohio. I thought I was trading chaos for silence. I was Evan Cole, 32 years old, and after 6 years of working the late shift at bars in crowded cities, enduring walls thinner than tracing paper and roommates who treated quiet hours as a personal challenge, the peace felt like a physical weight. My small fourth-floor apartment, Unit 6A, was modest, but it was mine. For the first few days, the only sound was the distant hum of the freeway and, when the window was open, the relentless, shimmering buzz of the cicadas. It was the sound of summer in the Midwest, and it felt safe. That peace lasted exactly 72 hours. I first encountered him in the third-floor landing. The building was old, and the fluorescent tubes in the hallways had an uneven, sickly yellow light that flickered like a dying strobe. He was standing by the mailboxes, not retrieving anything, just standing. He was Mr. Dennis Rourke, the resident of Unit 6B, directly across the hall from mine. He looked to be in his late 50s, dressed in a muted gray cardigan despite the heat, with thin white hair combed meticulously back. He had a nervous tick, a rapid, involuntary swallow that pulled the skin taut under his jaw. But it was his eyes that stopped me cold, wide, and intensely observational, like a lens focused on something infinitely small. I tried the friendly, new neighbor approach. "Hey, I'm Evan. Just moved into 6A. He didn't offer his hand. He merely tilted his head, the nervous swallow clicking in his throat. His voice, when it finally came, was a dry, academic whisper. "Welcome. I am Sir Dennis Rourke. I used to teach photography." He didn't move from the mailboxes until I was safely behind my locked door. Over the next 2 weeks, his presence became the dominant feature of the building. I'd leave for my evening shift, and he'd be standing by the third-floor stairwell, waiting. I'd come home at 3 a.m., exhausted and drained, and he'd be perched on the hallway bench, motionless, reading a book whose cover I could never quite make out. He never spoke after that first day. He just watched. The psychological tension began with the simple, visual facts. Whenever I peeked through my peephole, a habit I developed quickly, he was almost always there. Sometimes he'd be leaning against the wall directly opposite my door, looking at the number plate, 6A, as if trying to memorize the font. Other times, he'd be completely still, his back to my door, but his reflection caught clearly in the old glass of the fire extinguisher case, his eyes glued to my unit. I began to rationalize. He's old, he's lonely, he's a teacher, maybe he's just grading. But the rationalizations felt weak, flimsy, like the thin plywood the previous tenant had used to cover the holes in the wall. Then came the audio imagery that broke the silence. It was always between 1 a.m. and 3 a.m., usually just as the city noise outside finally died down, leaving only the distant drone of the cicadas. I would be lying awake, staring at the ceiling, when I'd hear it, a soft, repeated scraping sound, coming from the wall I shared with Unit 6B. It sounded like fingernails dragged across plaster, or perhaps something harder, a coin, or the edge of a plastic ruler. It was irregular, never a steady rhythm, but always present. Scrape, scrape, pause, scrape. I started sleeping with earplugs. They didn't work. The sound was not loud enough to register as noise. It was a vibration, a frequency that seemed to bypass my ears and resonate directly in the soft cartilage of my inner ear. One afternoon, I came home to find a note taped to my door. My heart hammered against my ribs. It was a single typed line. "The cicadas are too loud this year, aren't they?" Shh. It was a violation, a confirmation that he knew I left my window open, that he was listening to the sounds that filtered from my unit. The fear deepened into isolation. I stopped answering the door. I started timing my departures to avoid seeing him. I would wait, listening to the silence of the hallway, feeling the weight of his stare through the wood, until I was certain he was gone. Then, the psychological decline became tangible. One particularly restless night, around 2:30 a.m., I distinctly heard the scrape, followed by a soft, almost inaudible click. It was the sound of a door latch being manipulated. I bolted upright, my body covered in a film of cold sweat. I knew, with the certainty of primal terror, that Mr. Rourke was not just listening, he was entering my apartment. I spent the rest of the night curled on the floor, clinging to the baseball bat I kept by my bed, listening to my own ragged breathing over the silent, vibrating threat in the walls. The next morning, I was a functional wreck. I called the landlord, the police, citing harassment and strange noises. They found nothing. Mr. Rourke opened his door, offered a nervous, strained smile, and told the officer I seemed overly stressed. Later that day, I found the closing beat. I was getting ready for work, rushing to collect my uniform from the laundry basket, when I saw it, a small, white square, tucked neatly inside my folded jeans. It was a Polaroid photograph. My hands were shaking so violently I almost dropped it. The photo was stark, black and white, slightly grainy. It was a picture of me. I was asleep. The angle was low, intimate, taken from the foot of my bed. My mouth was slightly ajar, my breathing deep and unaware. In the foreground, I could clearly see the dark wood of my nightstand, the glow of the digital clock reading 2:48 a.m. There was no way for him to take that photo without standing right inside my bedroom. I didn't wait. I didn't pack. I called a friend, threw the key on the counter, and drove out of Dayton that same night, leaving the photograph face down on the floor. I didn't care about the deposit or the furniture. I only cared about the miles between myself and the cold, observational eyes of Mr. Dennis Rourke. It's been 7 months. I now live in a high-rise building in Chicago, Illinois. The windows are thick, the walls are concrete, and the sound is the distant, harmless roar of the city. I work the morning shift now. Tonight, the wind is howling off Lake Michigan. I am lying in my bed, bathed in the silent blue light of the late hour. I feel safe. I feel finally isolated. Then, through the thick Chicago concrete, I hear it. 3 slow, measured, and utterly distinct taps on the wall beside my head. Knock, knock, knock. The sound is not loud. It's a phantom vibration, a memory that has become a real, physical intrusion. I close my eyes, my breath catching in my throat, and I know that no matter where I go, I will always be in the room across the hall from Mr. Rourke. Story 2. I like watching Douglas Hale. I moved to Asheville, North Carolina, in October 2019, right as the Blue Ridge Mountains were shedding their color. I was Mara Jensen, 28, a bookstore clerk running away from a breakup, and a city that had grown too loud. I sought the quiet, the smell of wet leaves and pine needles. The building was old, and my second-floor hallway always smelled faintly of stale detergent and old carpet, a comforting, musty scent of domestic anonymity. Across the hall lived a Douglas Hale. He looked to be in his mid-30s, tall and perpetually faded. He wore the same faded baseball cap low over his eyes, and he always smelled faintly of stale tobacco. He was the kind of neighbor you instinctively avoided eye contact with, not out of malice, but out of a shared, unspoken agreement to exist in peace. I barely saw him, and when I did, he was always silent, too silent. For a few weeks, the anonymity held. I worked, I read, and I enjoyed the crisp mountain air. Then, the intrusions began. Subtle, deniable things that frayed the edges of my peace. The first time, I convinced myself it was stress. I returned late from a double shift and found my apartment door slightly ajar. The deadbolt was thrown, but the main latch hadn't caught. The door wasn't broken, wasn't forced. It had simply been opened and then gently pulled, almost shut. A spike of cold fear hit me. I closed it instantly, checking every closet. Nothing was missing. I must have forgotten to pull the handle hard enough. I rationalized, but the explanation tasted like ash. It happened again 2 days later. I came back from the grocery store, arms full, and saw the door, gaping wider this time. My heart began to hammer a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I knew, with absolute certainty, that I had locked it. I stood in the hall, my breath clouding the cold air, feeling the metallic chill of paper that had been slipped beneath the wood. I found the note inside, a small, neatly folded piece of printer paper. It wasn't a threat. It was completely blank, just white space, but it was a greater violation than any explicit threat. It announced, I was here. I passed this boundary. I bolted the main door with 2 new security locks. I stopped using my peephole. I started living in a self-imposed twilight, turning my small apartment into a big claustrophobic, lightless fortress. I knew Douglas was watching. I could feel the residual heat of his observation on the surface of my skin. Sleep became impossible. The absolute silence of the late hour, usually a comfort, turned oppressive. It was always around 2 a.m. when the city's distant traffic noise faded completely, that I would hear it, the faint white creak of wood beneath bare, shifting weight, coming from the hallway directly outside my door. It was too slow, too deliberate to be casual movement. It was the sound of someone standing perfectly still at my threshold, adjusting their stance, listening to the silence inside. The terror reached its breaking point on a slow Saturday morning. I was trying to read, to anchor myself in something normal. I was sitting in my kitchen when I heard his voice. It wasn't loud. It was a low, guttural murmur, transmitted clearly through the thin wall separating our units. She doesn't lock it. She leaves it open. His voice grated. Then, a softer, almost reverent giggle that sounded deeply wrong, like dry leaves being crushed. He wasn't talking on the phone. He was talking to someone else in his apartment, or perhaps, terribly, to himself. I couldn't stand the isolation or the uncertainty any longer. I was too terrified to call the police, knowing they would find nothing and leave me alone with the silence again. I decided on a confrontation. I waited until midnight. I listened to the muffled scraping outside, the familiar sound of his presence. My hands were shaking. I unlatched the security bolts, unlocked the deadbolt, and threw the door violently open. Douglas Hale stood there. He wasn't crouched or lurking. He was standing upright, his eyes wide with a fleeting expression of surprise at my sudden eruption. I stood in the doorway, hyperventilating. The heavy, sweet smell of old tobacco and fear rushed into my unit. "What do you want?" I managed, my voice thin and high. He looked at me for a sickeningly long moment, his eyes dark under the shadow of his cap. He didn't blink. He finally cracked a slow, cold smile, a look of satisfied ownership that didn't reach the emptiness in his eyes. And then he whispered, his voice a dry exhalation of air, "I like watching you read." He simply turned, walked the 3 steps to Unit 6B, and closed his door, leaving me paralyzed in the humid air, shattered by the naked intimacy of his statement. I ran. I grabbed my car keys, my wallet, and my phone. I abandoned everything else, driven by the absolute need to put distance between myself and that observation. I was driving away from Asheville before the dawn fully broke. I was 30 miles down a forgotten highway, the mountains receding into the rearview mirror. My old sedan was tearing through a small town, my headlights flickering across a wet, empty parking lot. I pulled into a gas station. As I reached for the pump, I saw it a small white square, fluttering against my windshield, caught by the wiper blade. I snatched it off the glass. It was folded neatly. When I unfolded the paper, the harsh, fluorescent lights of the gas station reflected off the familiar, precise handwriting. It was not a question. It was a promise, chilling in its finality. Next time you won't run. Story 3. The Scratching in the Walls, Mr. Keating. I moved into the small second-floor apartment in Old Lowell, Massachusetts, in November 2021. I was Caleb Turner, 31, a freelance designer, and I needed quiet, the kind of absolute stillness that lets you hear your own thoughts. The building was a tired, triple-decker relic with perpetually damp walls and floors that shifted underfoot. My landlord was Mr. Keating, a man in his late 60s with the permanently slumped shoulders of someone who had seen too much wear and tear. When I signed the lease, he was dismissive, almost hostile. When I asked about the building's history, he merely said, "It's old. Don't go looking for things that ain't there." His eyes, however, held a subtle flicker of fear, a hint that he knew precisely what was there. The quiet lasted a week. Then, the environment began to fight back. It started with the smell, a faint stale odor that lingered near the shared bathroom wall, not mold, but something mustier, a blend of old dust, unwashed linen, and a sharp, chemically lingering scent of cigarette smoke, even though I don't smoke and the building was non-smoking. Then came the sound. It was always late, 2:00 to 4:00. When the city outside had completely exhaled and gone silent, it was a faint, repulsive sound coming from the wall adjacent to my closet. Scratching, not the sharp scuttling of mice, but something slower, more deliberate, like fingernails dragging across plaster. I first dismissed it as old pipes contracting or insulation shifting, but the pattern was too organic. It would start low, a slow shh, pause for a long, held beat, and then resume, sometimes moving laterally across the wall, sometimes rising vertically. It was the sound of something alive and frustrated, trying to escape a barrier. I began to develop insomnia. The minute the lights went out, the scratching began its performance. I'd lie there, rigid under the covers, listening to the intimate geography of the sound, tracing the invisible movements behind the drywall. The noises escalated. The scratching became punctuated by a thin, desperate, whispering sound. It wasn't language, it was just breath, forced out through a crack or a vent. The whispers were always too low to understand, but the auditory pressure, the distinct presence of breath leaking from my wall, was horrifying. I finally called Mr. Keating. When he arrived, he looked pale and irritable. He listened at the wall for a tense minute, then banged on the plaster with his fist. The sound immediately stopped. "See?" he said, his voice flat. "Old building settling. It's the cold." But as he turned to leave, I saw him glance quickly at a small, discolored patch of plaster. Near the floorboard, a patch I hadn't noticed before. He quickly covered it with his foot. The scratching returned the instant he drove away. The whispers felt closer. They seemed to be pleading now, or perhaps mocking my sanity. My world shrank to the apartment. I stopped sleeping. I started leaving my light on, convinced the dark was what gave the occupant of the wall its strength. I developed a tic of constantly checking the discolored patch of plaster where Mr. Keating had paused. One restless night, driven by a primal need for certainty, I went to the wall with a box cutter. I didn't care about the deposit. I cut around the discolored area, peeling back the flaking paint and plaster. What I found was not a mouse hole, but a small, hinged hatch, roughly 6 by 8 inches, barely visible, secured with 2 tiny rusted screws. My hands shook as I worked the screws out. As the final one turned, the whispers behind the hatch stopped instantly. The silence was deafening, a vacuum where the scratching had been. I took a deep breath, fighting the sulfurous smell, and pulled the hatch open. I shone my phone flashlight into the void. It wasn't solid wall. It was a narrow, dark crawl space that ran between the beams, a gap wide enough for a human body to contort itself into. The flashlight beam caught something sickening, not dust, not wires, but a pile of filthy blankets, several empty water bottles, and a scatter of human fingernail clippings embedded in the dry dust. Someone hadn't just been in the walls, someone had been living there, and they had recently, very recently, vacated the space. My sanity shattered. I backed away, staring at the empty, claustrophobic tunnel, realizing that every whisper, every scrape had been real. That person or thing had been sharing my breath, listening to my life, separated only by an inch of plaster. I didn't call the police. I knew the moment the hatch opened, the occupant had simply moved. I packed a small bag and walked out of the building forever, leaving the hatch hanging open, staring into the dark. Lingering shot. It's 2 years later. I live in a modern high-rise in a city blocks away, sterile and new. I finally have the silence I craved. I am sitting at my desk, the only light coming from my lamp. The quiet is absolute. Then, the whole lamp flickers, a rapid, subtle pulse of light that makes the shadows jump. And from the thick, concrete wall behind my desk, I hear it, soft, rhythmic, and impossibly close. Shh. A slow, deliberate scratch of plaster. Shh. The sound of fingernails dragging across the wall, searching for the next small, discolored patch. Story 4. Room 6. Mr. Bishop. The heat of the wet Kansas highway in August 20 was a relentless physical pressure. I was Wade Ryan Mercer, 35, driving cross-country, and by 11 p.m., the road had dissolved into a hallucinatory tunnel of white lines and endless asphalt. I needed to stop. I found the motel 10 miles off the interstate. It was a single long concrete slab under a rusted by a tin roof, lit by a sputtering, aggressively red neon sign that declared motel in uneven letters. The sign's flickering created a constant, uneven pulse of light and shadow across the parking lot. The office was small and smelled of old coffee and bleach. Behind the counter sat Mr. Bishop, the owner. He was ancient, with a face mapped by wrinkles and liver spots. His hands, resting on the counter, were large and permanently stained by the sun. His eyes were the most disturbing feature, clouded, faded blue, and utterly vacant, like someone looking through water at a great distance. "Just for the night," I mumbled, pushing my credit card forward. He didn't look at me, only at the form. "Room 5, he wheezed, the sound catching in his throat like dry paper. "End of the line. Quieter." He handed me the key, a heavy piece of brass attached to a plastic diamond, and returned his gaze to some unseen point beyond my shoulder. Room 5 was exactly what the price implied: 2 single beds, a television bolted high on the wall, and carpet the color of old motor oil. The stillness, however, was immediately oppressive. It was the silence of a place that hasn't hosted a living, breathing soul in months. I locked the deadbolt, threw my duffel bag on the floor, and immediately felt the skin on the back of my neck tighten. I decided to try to sleep before the paranoia set in. Just as I settled down, the heavens broke. The dry Kansas sky opened up into a sudden, torrential downpour. The rain hammered the tin roof above Room 5 with a deafening, metallic roar that swallowed all other ambient noise. It was a beautiful, overwhelming sound. Then I heard something else. A faint thud. Muffled, dull, and entirely out of sync with the relentless rain. It came from the shared wall, the wall separating Room 5 from Room 6. Thud. Pause. Scrape. It sounded like a heavy suitcase being dragged, or perhaps just the old building settling. I tried to focus on the sound of the rain, willing the noise to become natural, but the thudding was too persistent, too deliberate. It was a low, insistent rhythm of struggle, buried beneath the storm. I put my ear to the wall. The plaster was cold and slightly gritty. The thudding was clearly there, accompanied now by a series of low, rhythmic, choking coughs. I could hear the desperate, ragged intake of breath. This wasn't luggage. This was a person trying to make noise without making noise. I walked the length of the wall, looking for a vent or a seam. Near the bathroom, I found it an old, cracked aluminum ventilation grate, painted over multiple times. I knelt down, the cold cement floor pressing into my knees, and put my ear right next to the grate. The sound of the rain receded. All I could hear was the frantic, rasping breathing on the other side. Then, the breathing stopped. The space went silent. The air held still, the silence heavier than the previous thudding. And then, a sound so faint, so delicate it was nearly absorbed by the concrete, filtered through the vent. It was a voice, squeezed and distorted by terror and desperation, reduced to a single, fragile word. "Help me!" My disbelief shattered instantly. The exhaustion, the rationalizations, the Kansas heat. It all dissolved into a single, overwhelming certainty there was a victim in room 6, and they knew I was in room 5. I scrambled back, grabbed my brass key, and ran into the flickering red hallway. Room 6 was 2 doors down. I stopped dead. The door was standard, wooden, but it was secured by a massive, rusty-weight padlock bolted right through the frame. It was not a door meant to be opened. I ran back to the office, my heart threatening to burst through my chest. Mr. Bishop was still there, sitting exactly as I left him. Mr. Bishop, I stammered, leaning over the counter. There's someone in room 6. They're locked in. I heard them. They asked for help. Mr. Bishop slowly raised his clouded eyes. The nervous tick wasn't visible, just the blank, empty stare. He didn't deny it. He didn't even acknowledge the urgency. He reached slowly under the counter and produced a small silver .22 revolver, a toy. Almost, but undeniably real. "Son," he said, his voice a dry whisper that seemed to come from the deep past. "You're in room 5. You leave room 6 alone. You just worry about your own quiet." He held the gun steady, resting his heavy to sun-spotted hands on the counter, making his intention clear. The silence in the office was immediate and devastating. I looked at the gun, then back at his vacant, unblinking eyes, and knew that calling the police from here was impossible. The guilt was a physical sickness. I had heard a direct plea for help, and I was being threatened into complicity. I walked backward, never taking my eyes off him, until I was outside. I jumped into my car and drove. I drove east, pushing the accelerator to the floor, leaving the flickering red neon and the sound of the relentless rain hammering the tin roof far behind me. It was 3 days later. I was in a sterile, safe hotel room in St. Louis. I couldn't sleep, but the adrenaline had worn off, replaced by a deep, hollow well of guilt. I was watching the national news on the wall-mounted TV. The segment was brief, tucked between 2 political stories. Local news from Kansas, a missing persons report, the blurry photo of a young woman who had disappeared 3 weeks prior. The camera cut to the location, a drone shot of a desolate stretch of highway and a low concrete motel under a rusted tin roof. The neon sign was unmistakable. The reporter pointed. Local authorities are focusing their search on this remote location, particularly a room that has been walled off for several years. We're told the room is White Room 6. My coffee cup slipped from my trembling hand and shattered on the carpet, the hot liquid scalding my skin. I stared at the television, not at the image of the motel, but at the digital clock on the screen showing the present date. And then I whispered, the words catching on my breath, the awful, definitive realization settling like a stone in my soul. I wasn't in room 6. I was in White Room 5. Story 5, The White Van. Life in Carmel, Indiana. In October 2022. Felt curated for safety. I was with Daniel Brooks, 39, a single father, and I had chosen this quiet suburb specifically for its predictability. My daughter, Olivia, was 8, all boundless energy, vibrant laughter, and the kind of blinding, uncomplicated innocence that felt like a shield against the world. Every morning, the sunlight would catch the brilliant red and gold of the fall leaves as I drove her to school, the tires making a satisfying, reassuring crunch of leaves under the asphalt. That routine, the beautiful, boring routine, was the foundation of my sanity. The foundation cracked with the arrival of the white vans. It appeared first as a simple detail, an unmarked, full-sized white panel van, parked 3 houses down from mine. It had blacked-out windows and no identifying plates or logos. It was just an anonymous vehicle, but its presence felt aggressive. I saw it every morning during the busy mud school traffic, blending in perfectly, yet somehow standing out. I rationalized. It's a contractor, a cable guy, it's temporary. But it never moved. It just sat there, a hulking block of denial in a neighborhood built on transparency. My caution began to turn to worry when I started noticing it at night. I would wake up around midnight, a light, unnatural wakefulness, and hear the sound of a low engine idle. Not the roar of a car driving by, but a deep, vibrating thrum that traveled through the cool evening air and into my floorboards. I would creep to Olivia's window and peek through the blinds, and there it would be, the white van, usually parked 1 house closer now, the engine running, a phantom vehicle in the dark. I could never see anyone inside, but the low, patient thrum suggested waiting. I stopped sleeping. I spent hours sitting in the dark of my living room, the baseball bat resting on the arm of the chair, staring at the street. I became a sentinel, replacing the warm sense of domestic peace with cold, obsessive fear. Then came the first confirmation of intrusion. It was a Tuesday. I got home from work and immediately noticed the change, the subtle, undeniable feeling that something had been moved. The remote control was on the wrong side of the sofa. The front doormat was slightly skewed. I told myself I was becoming paranoid, that the van was driving me insane. Later that evening, as I was reading Olivia a story, I heard a soft, dull thud against the front door. It wasn't a knock. It was the sound of something being taped. And a release. My blood turned to ice. I silently put Olivia to bed, her small, innocent voice fading into the quiet hallway. I waited until the lights were out, and then I crept to the front door, heart hammering against my ribs. I found an envelope, plain white, taped low to the wood. My name was scrawled across the front in thick block letters. Inside was a single, slightly wrinkled piece of paper. Not a blank note this time, but a message written in the same thick hand. She has the warmest smile. My hands shook. Olivia, the psychopath, knew my daughter's most essential quality. This was no random threat. This was intimate observation. The war innocence of my daughter was now a weapon used against me. The fear turned to raw, animal obsession. I installed cameras, but they were useless. The van always moved just outside their range. I parked my car sideways in the driveway to block the view of the living room window. I became hostile to every unknown pedestrian. The worst night came a week later. I had finally drifted into an exhausted sleep around 3 a.m. The low, familiar idle of the white van, outside providing a perverse, unwanted lullaby. I woke up to the sound of my phone buzzing on the nightstand. It was a message from an unknown number. My fingers were shaking too hard to unlock the screen. When I finally opened the message, it was a file attachment. It was a video. I hit play. The short clip was filmed in complete darkness, grainy and saturated with the green glow of night vision. The camera was inside my house. It was a close-up, intimate shot of my own face. I was asleep. The camera was positioned just 3 feet from my head. I could hear the faint, uneven rhythm of my own breathing. The sound quality was perfect, capturing the soft rush of air as I exhaled. The person holding the camera had been in the room, watching me, recording me, while the white van idled outside, muffling any potential sound. The violation was absolute. The protective barrier between my world and the encroaching darkness had been utterly demolished. I deleted the file, smashed the phone, and ran to Olivia's room. She was sleeping soundly, curled up like a comma, her chest rising and falling in perfect oblivious safety. I packed 2 bags, one for me, one for her. We were gone before the first hint of sunrise touched the Carmel skyline. I drove east, never looking in the rearview mirror, every mile fueled by the desperate, primal urge to protect the light of her smile from the darkness that knew her name. We settled temporarily hundreds of miles away, in a city where the noise was loud and the lights were endless. It was a cold, unfamiliar sunrise. I was walking Olivia to her new school, her small hand warm in mine. I looked left, then right, then left again, a ritual I now perform for every crossing, every doorway. The street was busy. The morning traffic flowed, merging, accelerating. And then I saw it, moving slowly, deliberately, merging seamlessly into the stream of anonymous commuters. A white panel van, unmarked, blacked-out windows. It passed us slowly, then accelerated away. I stopped, pulling Olivia close to my side, watching the vehicle until it vanished. I told myself it was just a coincidence, just a common commercial vehicle. But as the white van disappeared around the corner, leaving only the sound of crushing gravel in its wake, I knew the game had merely relocated. The hunt was still on. I am Eli Navarro, 33, a film archivist living in a perpetually shadowed block of Baltimore, Maryland. My world exists in the pale, flickering glow of obsolete technology. I spent my days meticulously cataloging decaying 35mm prints and my evenings hunting through thrift stores for strange, abandoned media cassette tapes, Super 8 reels, and, most frequently, VHS tapes. To me, these artifacts held an undeniable truth, the unedited, uncurated lives they inadvertently captured. The air in my apartment always carried the metallic tang of dust and old plastic, a comfort that soon became the scent of my obsession. My discovery began on a wet Tuesday afternoon at a store simply called the Media Graveyard. The interior was a cavern of dark, forgotten shelves. Every footstep echoed hollowly off the concrete floor, a sound that always emphasized the profound emptiness of the place. Behind the counter, as always, sat Mr. Dawes. He was a skeletal man whose skin looked thin and translucent. His fingers, permanently stained a deep yellow-brown from decades of nicotine, rested on a stack of battered jewel cases. He possessed an unnerving stillness. He didn't fidget, didn't cough, and his eyes, sunken and watchful, never left the front door. I asked him about any recent acquisitions. Without speaking, he pointed a jaundiced finger toward a cardboard box under the counter. "Lot 149, he whispered, the sound scraping against his throat like fine grit. "Unsorted. 40 tapes." The box felt heavy and cold. I paid the minimal amount, the sound of the register cha-chinking loudly in the silent store, and left without Mr. Dawes saying another word. Back in my apartment, I set up the viewing station. My trusted chunky CRT television sat on a milk crate, ready to display its grainy, beautiful distortion. The moment I plugged in the VCR, the room filled with the sharp, acidic smell of ozone and the flicker of CRT static. The first 3 tapes of Lot 149 were an exercise in suburban boredom, a blurry baptism, a birthday party with a camera left rolling on a kitchen counter, and a silent 6-hour shot of an empty pool in someone's backyard. Mundane, yes, but they fed my obsession the belief that I was a privileged witness to the quiet, unedited truth of another existence. I loaded the fourth tape. It began differently. The tape was marked only with a single, handwritten date from 6 months prior. The footage was immediately unsettling. It was shot in complete darkness, lit only by a faint, sickly green infrared glow, and entirely motionless. The metallic tang of dust and old plastic in my room suddenly felt sharp and dangerous. The camera was aimed low, at a patch of carpet and a baseboard. For the first 20 minutes, there was nothing but the steady, low thrum of an HVAC system in the background. My initial interest faded into annoyance. I was about to eject the tape, convinced it was just another accidental recording of a closet floor, when a sound drew my attention. It was a slow, uneven breathing. The camera moved. Slowly, deliberately. The frame tilted up, gliding across the dark, heavy shape of a desk, then the cluttered surface of a nightstand. I sat bolt upright, recognizing the cheap particle board desk. The specific mug, the geography of the shot was terrifyingly familiar. The camera continued its agonizingly slow pan. It moved past the blurred shape of a jacket draped over a chair, then focused entirely on the bed. And there I was. Me. The shot was close, intimate, horrifying. I was lying on my side, deeply asleep. My face was visible, slack with exhaustion. The low green light of the night vision captured the gentle, rhythmic rise and fall of my chest. It was silent footage, but I could hear my own soft, vulnerable breaths echoing in the apartment. The camera lingered for over 3 minutes, an eternity. The person holding it was standing less than 5 feet from my head. I could see, in the deep foreground of the shot, a fleeting shadow on the pillow that suggested a figure leaning in close. My breath caught in my throat. I didn't move. I stared at the screen, watching myself sleep, watching the absolute violation unfold, realizing the infection wasn't just in the tapes, it was in my home. I scrambled backwards, kicking the milk crate and sending the television tumbling to the floor. The screen went dark, but the hum of the VCR continued its quiet, mocking drone. Hum. My rational mind tried to claw its way back. It's an old tape. It was an old apartment. But I knew the truth. The jacket was the one I'd bought last month. The clutter on the nightstand was exactly as I'd left it 2 nights ago. I spent the next 3 hours in a frantic, feverish hunt, checking every vent, every lock, every closet. There was no physical entry point. The locks were sound, the windows secure, yet the camera had been inside, capturing my most vulnerable state. The obsession I had for found footage had been violently turned inward. I was no longer the detached observer. I was the object of observation. The vulnerability of the suburbia had been replaced by the absolute claustrophobic invasion of the city. I called the police, but my story, the strange video I found of myself asleep in the dark, which was sold to me by a skeletal man in a thrift store, made me sound immediately, dangerously unhinged. They advised me to change the locks and assured me the man would be gone by the time they visited the store. I didn't wait. I grabbed my VCR and the box of tapes, and I fled the Baltimore apartment. I didn't drive. I just walked, merging into the vast, anonymous crowd, convinced the only way to be unseen was to be everywhere. I returned a week later, fueled by a morbid, archival need to understand the source. The thrift store was still open, the hollow echo of my footsteps, Greeting me as I entered, Mr. Dawes sat behind the counter, perfectly still. He looked up. His eyes, though sunken, held a flicker of unexpected clarity. He smiled a small, nicotine-stained contortion of the mouth. "You dropped off a tape," he rasped, gesturing toward a plain, unlabeled black VHS cassette resting on the counter. "I figured you'd want it back. It's the newest entry." I didn't argue. I snatched the tape, fled the store, and drove back to my apartment. I rushed inside, shaking, and immediately loaded the new cassette into the VCR. I looked at the label, which was written in the same thick block lettering as the date on the previous tape. It read only, "Lot 150. Before I could press play, the year's CRT screen shuddered, and the VCR unit, without any input from me, began to whir. The tape inside the machine started playing on its own. The first shot was of the inside of my apartment, not the old one, but this one. The camera was aimed directly at the television screen I was currently staring at. The image on the screen was me, right now, holding the remote, watching the monitor. Lube. The screen flickered, and then the camera moved up, focusing tightly on a specific piece of furniture in the background, my old, cheap, particle board desk, which was currently placed against the wall. And then I heard the subtle, soft, undeniable sound coming from the wall behind the desk, a faint scratching. The camera holding the loop began to slowly pan downwards until the image on the screen was focused entirely on a small, discolored patch of plaster near the floorboard. Story 7. Lot 150, Logan James. I moved to Maplewood, Oregon, to be near him. My name is Noah Green. I'm 30, and Logan James was my best friend since kindergarten. We shared everything, our worst secrets, our dreams, and a mutual comfortable understanding of the world. Logan was my anchor, the one stable point in a life that often felt too vast and chaotic. In the wake of my own terrifying encounter with the Lot 149 tapes, the discovery that someone had been recording me in my own apartment, Logan was the person I turned to. He offered the perfect blend of sympathy and practical disbelief, always rationalizing the footage as a hoax or a random, disconnected prank. He let me stay on his couch, offering me a temporary refuge that smelled of Old Spice and coffee. The horror began to reassert itself when I found his box of media. I was cleaning his garage, an old detached structure with a perpetually creaking door, and the heavy metallic smell of oil and damp earth. Tucked away beneath a tarp, I found a sealed cardboard box. It was precisely the same size and type as the one Mr. Dawes had given me in Baltimore. The label on the side was handwritten, precise, and immediately paralyzing. Lot 150. The blood drained from my face. Lot 150. The exact impossible number written on the tape. I had fled my apartment to escape the tape Mr. Dawes had claimed was the newest entry. I opened the box. Inside were dozens of neatly labeled VHS tapes, and resting on top, nestled in a bed of old plastic, was a collection of Polaroid photographs. They were not photos of me, but they contained the same quiet horror: strangers asleep, strangers staring blankly at a camera they clearly didn't know was there. One photo was a tight shot of a man's neck, the light catching the faint protrusion of vertebrae, the same disturbing anatomy I had seen in the dog from the Mr. Hale story. The logical part of my brain screamed, "It's a coincidence. Logan collects tapes too." But the primal part knew I was standing in the predator's lair. I didn't confront him immediately. I needed confirmation. I waited for the late hour, the familiar anxiety of the night returning to my temporary refuge. At 3:00 a.m., I finally called him. I was standing by the rain-streaked window, watching my own reflection in the glass, which was distorted by the wind headlights on wet asphalt. Logan was miles away, working the graveyard shift at a distribution center. "Hey man, what's up?" His voice was calm, familiar, and utterly steady, the voice of my oldest friend. I didn't mention the box. I asked him about the strangest things he'd ever seen people do when they thought they were alone. He laughed. "Why? You worried about the surveillance, now you're lot 150, man. You should be used to it." The laughter stopped abruptly. I froze, the phone pressed against my ear, listening to the static-laced silence on the line. I hadn't told him the number. Not once. "Lot 150, I repeated, my voice a shaking whisper. "How did you know that number?" "Logan." The silence stretched, cold and deep, the only sound the quiet yet thrum of the rain outside. When he spoke again, his voice was no longer that of my best friend. It was measured, toneless, and academic, the same cold observation I remembered from Mr. Dennis Rourke. "I taught the course, Noah. I was the curator." He didn't need to say more. The truth hit me with the force of an oncoming train. Logan was not just a fellow collector. He was the common thread, the inheritor of the voyeuristic legacy that had stalked me from Dayton to Lowell, from Kansas to Baltimore. The entire terrifying journey had been curated by my own best friend. A betrayal so vast, it devoured all our shared history. I hung up, heart pounding a fatalistic rhythm, and ran back to the garage. I found the VCR in the corner, taped shut, and next to it, the tape marked Lot 150. The fear was gone, replaced by a cold, heavy acceptance of my fate. I loaded the tape into the VCR and hit play. The footage was a single, long shot of a room, a simple empty motel room. Then the camera panned slowly to a single object on the dresser, a brass key attached to a plastic diamond. The key to room 5. The voice of Logan, now the voice of the predator, began to speak, flat and devoid of emotion. "You're running, Noah. That's fine. But the lesson of the lots isn't about the where, it's about the process. And now that you know, you can't be an observer anymore." The camera tilted, focusing on a figure lying on the bed, the sleeping body of the watchman in room 5 from the Kansas motel. The footage was grainy, but the guilt was immediate. Logan had been there. He had filmed it. The legacy was vast and shared. The final shot was Logan himself, standing in the frame, wearing the old faded baseball cap I'd seen in Asheville, the cap belonging to Douglas Hale. He looked directly into the camera, not smiling, but looking like a masterpiece finally completed. I woke up suddenly. I was in a strange bed. I looked around the room, generic art, thin blanket, the familiar, suffocating stillness of a cheap road motel. I was lying in the exact room shown on the tape, room 5. I wasn't in Oregon. I didn't remember driving. The last thing I remembered was watching the tape in Logan's garage. I sat up, rigid with absolute terror. On the dresser, the small wall-mounted television, a black void in the pale morning light, suddenly flickered to life. The VCR was already running. The screen displayed a static title card in thick, block letters. Lot 150 final sale. I could hear the slow, rhythmic click of a camera shutter outside the room, followed by the soft, distant creak of a garage door. I was no longer the collector, the fugitive, or the friend. I was the final, completed exhibit. "You can change your name," You can move to another city. You can replace every lock on every door. But you can't escape the quiet moments, those seconds between breaths, when the dark feels heavier than it should. Because some stories don't end when the credits roll. They just move to the next town, to the next apartment, to the next person who thinks it could never happen to them. Pause, faint static crackles. A single knock echoes. Sleep well tonight, and if you hear something, don't answer it.